Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Alana Erickson. I am the Vice President for the League of Women Voters of Winnebago County, and I'll let my guests introduce themselves.
I'm Nathaniel Shuda. I'm the editor for the Oshkosh Northwestern, which is also part of the USA Today network. So I'm also the statewide assistant breaking news editor for USA Today Network Wisconsin.
I'm Miles Maguire. I'm a professor of journalism at UW-Oshkosh, and I also edit a website called the Oshkosh Examiner.
All right, so tonight we're going to talk a little bit about fake news or misinformation. I'm going to start off with kind of giving a presentation of social media's role in spreading that information. I work with social media every day, and it's not always fun, but it's my job. I have a master's in public health, so I knew that I wanted to go out and share important breaking news with a lot of different target audiences, and social media was the place to go. So I've worked in this field for about 10 years, and currently I'm the communications specialist for the Winnebago County Health Department. So you will be getting these slides afterwards. You can come up to me and I can share those. Oshkosh Media will have them when this is broadcasted. We'll also put them on the League of Women Voters website. So today I'm just going to cover a little bit about why social media plays a role, how fake news is created and then disseminated, and then tips for you about being a responsible consumer. As I'm going through the presentation, I encourage you to think about how you use social media yourself and kind of relate that to where you get your news. Are you getting your news from the local sources that we have here? And think of questions that these guys will be able to give you the right answer for. So when social media really ticked up, in 2005, about 5% of US adults were using social media, and now it's 69%. So 7 in 10 people use at least some form of social media. It's too big to ignore. I learned that a lot when I did my thesis research, saying that we have to be using social media to promote public health. And in my first few jobs, it was very hard to convince my boss that they need to pay me to be on social media. But now it's definitely a game changer and something that most people in everywhere, as you'll see, are using it. So who is using it is kind of surprising. In the beginning, we saw a lot of younger people using it, but the gaps are closing across a lot of demographics. So we see social media used similar across age, income, race, gender, education, and even community. So rural people, urban people, about the same. Education, across all levels of education, people are using it. Males and females use it the same. They just tend to gravitate towards different platforms. So that comes on the back end when you're trying to target your messaging. You figure out who you're trying to get your message out to, and then you pick that platform. But when we're taking these sum totals of that 7 in 10 adults that's using it, really the demographics are showing that it's pretty spread across the evenly spread across the different demographics. So once it was considered a place to play and interact and use for fun, and now it's part of our everyday life. We use it not only for entertainment, but for business. I'm sure some of you have a banking app where you can deposit checks, or you log your fitness. It's really a great way to find your place, or find your way to a new place. Google Maps, probably all use that. So it's becoming ubiquitous in the sense that we use it multiple times a day and all of them are connected. We're using it so much because it's available everywhere. So instead of having to be sitting at a desk at a computer, there's now many other devices such as your phone, your laptop, even TVs now have capability to access these different social media channels. The reason I think that it really exploded in use is the versatility. So social media is real time. You don't have to wait for the 7 a.m. broadcast to get the news out. It can happen right there in the moment. There's also exponential reach. So I share it with Nathan, who shares it with his 3 friends, who each share it with their 5 friends, and pretty soon it takes off. There's the engagement aspect where people can ask questions and get answers right on a specific topic where isn't always available with your newspaper. You have to call someone or track them down. And then there's so many different formats. So we've learned that people take in imagery about 60 times faster than text. So social media was a really easy way for people to consume public messages in a fast, effective way. And then we customize it to the user experience. So, again, with that targeting the message. The cost, the return on investment is really great. Yes, you have to have the person and the expertise that's putting the social media messaging together, but after that, it is very cost effective. And I found this out in 2010 when I was starting out at a nonprofit community health center. I had many different audiences that I needed to reach with different messaging, and the newspaper would only let us have 1 article per week. And I didn't even know if, certain people that I was trying to reach read that newspaper. So social media was a way for me to put it in multiple formats, multiple places, again and again. So the intent versus the outcome with misinformation. So I'm maybe naive in this, but I don't always think that people are malicious, and the intent may not always be to spread false information, but the outcome's always the same. The thing is, there's different error that comes in. With human, if it's intentional misinformation, then we call it disinformation. So this is intentionally sharing wrong information for whatever gain that you're trying to get out of it. There's also human unintentional sharing of messaging. So we are human, we're bound to mistakes, and we have trouble critically thinking about things. So sometimes we seek out information that confirms our own biases. So it's natural that we see something, we agree with it, we want to share it. We see something else that we don't agree with, that's fake, that's false. And that's just habit, it's the way that we're wired, but we can get better at that. There's also now the technology side of it. So there's hacking. There's people that can, use your social media account, your platform, or create fake platforms to disseminate information that's not really you. And then the last is unintentional from technology. So we now have artificial intelligence that's creating news stories. What used to take much, much more manpower to write hundreds of stories in different ways for different audiences, there's now templates that can run certain phrases and topics, and then once the data is ready, that will be pushed out. So while they're getting really good, and it's quite remarkable what artificial intelligence can create on its own, there are still mistakes, and then that gets spread before it can be corrected. So I was going to talk a little bit about how easy it is to create fake news, and obviously that has to do with a lot of different things. Skill. If you went through the school system after the 90s, you're used to the internet, and you can create a web page pretty easily. And so that's always at the tip of your hand if that's your intent. I could probably put up a web page in about 15 minutes, and it would be free to me. And that could be on any topic, which I'll show you in just a little bit. The effort, not so much. I mean, I could do a Google search, find a few topics, put a link in there, and make it look real. So there's just a lot of copy and paste. Again, it just comes down to what is the intent or the purpose that you're trying to do. So here's something I decided to write about sharks in Winnebago, Lake Winnebago. This is a real story, obviously. Written today by myself, who is a DNR expert. And you throw this together, do a little copy paste to your text, make it align to what you want the message to be. Then you throw in a picture that'll really scare people, put in a logo that looks trustworthy, But most importantly, you need to give people a way to share or disseminate this message. So putting in the links to share it right to their social media. And not gonna lie, if I put this up, it would probably get shared. Then there's the other side, as I was talking about, the artificial intelligence. There's many bots out there that can create news stories, that can even create videos, and they're doing it all to try to be the first one to have the story ready. And it's really helping these news outlets be on the cutting edge, and it's saving tons of manual labor, but sometimes it's just not right, and it goes out the door before it's completely accurate. With that, I can say if I had one, it would save me a lot of grief, because even for the health department, sometimes I have one concept or message, and I need to turn that into 8 different versions. I need my full report, my one-pager, my infographic, my Facebook, my Twitter post, a video with it would be nice. And so these different types of technology are really helping one concept turn into many different formats to meet the needs of whatever someone wants to consume, and there's always a downfall. But mostly it's a good thing, and I want one. So then it comes to how we spread it. Like I said, giving people ways to email it, to share a link, to put it on their social media, having those types of buttons right on that page really prompts folks to, just go ahead and share that message with someone that they think will find it informational. Sharing and boosting isn't that expensive. In fact, I get this little message right here every single day on my Facebook pages that I manage, and it's saying, yay, you can reach 430 people per day for just $1. And you might not think that's a lot, but we don't have that great of, because of the algorithms with Facebook. So if you manage a Facebook page and you have 700 followers, only about 10 to 20% of those people are organically going to see your message. So paying for it or boosting it really helps the message go a lot further. And even with it being so cheap, we're still on scale to spend about $15.36 million this year as a nation on social media advertising. So just to kind of share how big of a deal this is, I'm sorry if you can't see this graph, later you'll be able to zoom in a little bit more, but it's showing that fake news sites, traffic is driven there, or people get there from social media 40% of the time. Whereas trusted news sites, people are only getting there from social media 10% of the time. So it's not like people are purposely going out to these bad sources and seeking out bad websites. They're getting pushed there from social media. So social media is the catalyst that is pushing this bad information out, where maybe 8 years ago it could have been more easily ignored and it would have been below the radar because you didn't trust those sites, you didn't seek out those sites, you didn't just subscribe from some kind of newsletter there. Again, every single day working in Facebook, I have multiple messages telling me, hey, for $1, for $3, this top one says, for $3 you can reach 1,400 people. That's a lot. And it's not just 1,400 random people, it's 1,400 targeted people that I get to choose various demographics for. So I can say, I want females only, I want them of, maybe childbearing age, so maybe I'm going to choose 18 to 34. I want them in my geography so that if they call me up, I can make sure that our services are provided for them. So there's all these different techniques so that I can zero in on a very specific population and get the most bang for my buck. Here's where I was just showing some pictures of how you choose the different demographics, but then also where it shows up is all over. It's not just like a very obvious, this is an ad. On your mobile phones, it will look like a regular post. When you're signing in or out of Facebook, it's the background. And you might not even notice that you're consuming that information, but you are. You can also target these ads based on your interests. So if you're someone that likes to run and you've liked a couple running pages and you've ever made a post about your new running shoes, you're gonna start to get ads that are geared toward running races or new clothes for runners, stuff like that. And I should definitely say it's not just Facebook. I just live and work in Facebook the most, so that's why I'm using these examples, and I assumed it would be the most obvious in this room. But definitely the other social media platforms are playing the same game. So how do we stop this? How do we kind of put the brakes on? And there is no easy answer. I'm not the expert, but a few things that I try to tell people that are really frustrated with their Facebook feeds and what they're seeing, and there are some tips that we can take as both consumers and producers. So publishers, we need the wow factor. We try to go for something that's, you know, gonna splash across the page and be really interesting. However, the consumer, if you're smart, you can see past that, and maybe you'll actually read the article before sharing it. Sometimes articles get shared so much and the title doesn't match the content. It's like my favorite example of how lazy we're getting. We're like, yes, I agree with that sentence. I'm going to share it because there's probably a lot of research behind it, and we didn't take the time to read the article. So Facebook is also tailored to show you content that you favor, the way that the pages that you like, your friends, it's all in this very fancy algorithm behind the scenes. And so you tend to see information that you like and agree with. So maybe step out of your comfort box and follow a couple other pages that you wouldn't normally. So you start to see a more balanced presentation of what is actually out there. Again, we search for and validate our own beliefs. It always happens. And it's understandable, but maybe like keep your friends close, your enemies closer. See what everyone else is saying. Get the whole picture. Know what the arguments against are. That's the best way to have the full picture. Also, if you do disagree with something and you're really mad about it, don't share it with, you know, a rant and a rave, because you're promoting their message again. And even when you go on and you give them the mad face, or you write a paragraph about how this is disgraceful, that is all clicking up that algorithm. So actually engaging in very negative language isn't helping your cause at all. I'm not saying don't have civil discourse. That's great. Go on there and, you know, have a very confident, research-based discussion. That's great, but don't just rant and rave, because that's not solving anything. So looking at your Facebook page where ads can show up, side, top, one of the key things, let's see if you're not going to be able to see it, but right here next to the name, it's going to say suggested post, and that's a really soft, kind word for this has been paid for. So if you see suggested posts, someone's paid to put that information in front of you, and it's not to say that it's not true, it's not to say that it's not an important message, but it's something that you should be aware of and think about as you're consuming that information. Another thing with different accounts, they can be verified. So on Twitter, when you see the checkbox next to the name, that means it's been verified. It's an actual, real, legitimate source, and it's not someone out there who's created a fake account to try to spread false information. So these links look like they can't be seen hardly anywhere in the room, but don't worry, when you get your hands on the PDF, they're all real links so that you'll be able to find those pages directly. What I've written up here is www.snopes.com, and so that's like an urban legend and a rumor check. There's also PolitiFact, I can say it. And that's fact checking for journalism. So somebody makes some sort of claim, they'll go in there and use the meters to really show, is this on point? Are they way off track? Both really good sources if you're seeing something go around and around on Facebook to see if what they're saying really lines up with the research behind it. And it's good to read those PolitiFact articles because sometimes you'll learn more about your own beliefs, and they really do a good job of showing both sides, saying yes, but this, or the reason they can say that is because there's this behind it. So it's good information for everyone. So local coverage really matters. Having places that you can go to, you can turn to, that you trust is a big deal, because if you know the actual writer of your article, you can put a lot more stock in that than something from a high-end producer that you don't know if it was artificial intelligence, or it could be someone sitting in a basement that put that, you know, fancy logo on it like I just did with sharks in Winnebago. So really look for the local information, and what they're sharing has to be up to a certain standards. And these guys will talk more about journalism standards in a little bit, but that's a good place to start. If you're wary and you don't know where to go, start following their social media, because social media is very great, convenient. It's at, you know, your phone's right there, so use it, but just use it right. So we are having a lunch and learn on October 10th, where we're going to talk a little bit more about, you know, promoting the correct message and getting that kind of stuff out there. So here's my little plug for League of Women Voters. Come join us at our luncheon on that day. It's at Primo Restaurant, and you can find that on our Facebook as well. So I want to leave with saying, don't give up. Social media, the internet, it can be very frustrating, and I've had a lot of people just say, like, I don't care about it, like I'm not even going to participate anymore. The thing is, some people, and as an individual, you have that right, but when you're an organization or you represent something, everyone else is on there, and if you're not talking for yourself, they're going to talk for you. So think about it in those terms. So be a voice of reason, be on there, and be responsible. When you receive the slides, I have a lot of references with the articles in there that I use to put this presentation together, and you are more than welcome to contact me with questions. So I am going to now turn it over to Nathan and Miles, and they'll talk a little bit about their role, their experience with news and information, and how they do their job on a day-to-day basis to combat this kind of thing.
I think one of the things that I always often talk about when I'm talking about the concept of fake news, I know it's kind of a buzzword or a catchphrase that has become much more popular, you know, recently. I mean, I understand why people are using the term, but for me, I don't really like the term fake news, just because obviously being a person involved in journalism. For me, that's kind of an oxymoron. I mean, if it's fake, then it's not real news. One of the things that I keep going back to, and I mention when having discussions about this type of thing, is a quote from Joanne Littman, was the former chief content officer for the USA Today network. She said, using the phrase fake news gives it a legitimacy that it doesn't deserve. She said, news organizations don't produce fake news. What we're talking about is not news by any definition. It's false information or propaganda, and you need to call it what it is. Why would you use a term that falsely describes something? So I think that that is something that I keep going back to on the topic of fake news or false information is you know, by definition, news. You know, in theory, news is true and accurate and factual information. So that was just the little bit that I thought I'd throw in there as well. But as we kind of talked about, there are a couple of different definitions, I think, that fake news can mean in today's society. And one, I think we touched on both of them a little bit. One of them, you know, is actual false information. something that is not based in fact, or is just untrue, or disinformation sometimes, if you will. And then, of course, there's the other, I think, is becoming more common, kind of definition, is the aspect of, information that any particular viewer or reader, might not necessarily agree with, or something that doesn't fit their worldview. And there's a variety of different ways to combat that. I think the only other thing that I would bring up with that is that there's a difference. I think there's a difference between so-called fake news and something that is like satire or parody or something like that. How many people here are familiar with the publication called The Onion? Almost everyone. So there are outlets like that, The Onion, or its a sister publication, the AV Club. There's a military one as well, geared toward military folks, called the Duffel Blog. And of course, on TV, there's the Daily Show, for example, that is in some respects, a satire or parody, kind of talking about issues of the day, but you doing it in a different type of way. So I've interacted with a lot of people who might not even know what The Onion is, but they will see an article on Facebook or on the internet from The Onion and read it thinking that it's a real news story. Part of consuming those types of things is being responsible and doing the research on where those stories are coming from. Usually on a website like that, if you go to the About Us section, most reputable websites have an About Us section. If it doesn't, that's the first sign that might be something wrong. There's other websites out there that right under their About section will say, this is a parody website, or a couple of examples just within the past couple of years here in Oshkosh. Were stories about people like Will Ferrell buying a home on Lake Winnebago. And that was from March 2016, but the website was called KY6 News. And if you went to their About Us section on their website, it literally said, this is not legitimate, this is made up entirely. I don't know if you used the word fake, but is basically, this is fake news right on the website. And so there's other examples like that. Julia Roberts having car trouble on I-41. I mean, that was another one that was going around. And we actually debunked some of these as more and more people were going out on the internet and sharing them, or saying, hey, guess what? Will Ferrell's moving here, or Julia Roberts had car trouble. And we said, no, this is not a real news story. So there's a lot of other things that I think I could talk about, but I'll leave it at that for now and turn it over to Miles.
Okay, great, thanks. I don't think I've heard anything that I would disagree with, so I'll just try to pick up on a couple of points and maybe try to amplify them and perhaps give a slightly different take, perhaps. The first thing that I think people need to be aware of is something that Alana mentioned, which is that social media and the web in general is a fantastic medium for advertising. It is both very efficient and very targeted. And the prices that you pay are minuscule, and your ability to go after a specific audience are just remarkable. Great if you're advertising, but if you think back for a second that the business model that newspapers, particularly local newspapers, have relied on is advertising based. And so Facebook and Google are not only, I think, to a certain degree, kind of damaging our information infrastructure, they're also undermining the way the news media have operated. And I think that they have led to some deterioration. So that's something to think about. There is a move afoot in Washington to find some way to regulate the internet and social media. As a journalist and a professor of journalism, I have some doubts about whether it's a good idea to start, fudging with the First Amendment. But I think you have to recognize the reality that Facebook and Google and the other social media have managed to accumulate a great deal of information about us, about all of us in this room, and they know how to use it, and they aren't necessarily using it on our behalf. So I think that's something you should be aware of. Another point that I often preach when people are asking about, how to evaluate the news and whether something is fake or not, is that you really can detect the quality of the reporting that's been done if you are able to look past kind of the surface content of a story and actually look at how the reporter has put the story together. And just very quickly, all of the news comes from one of three channels, is the word that Bob Woodward, the Washington Post reporters, used. Reporters either get documents, they interview people, or they make direct observations. And each one of those things has pluses and minuses. Sometimes we think of eyewitness news as being kind of the gold standard, right there observing firsthand what's going on. But actually, many of us are not great observers, and the other very important limiting factor is that the observation is based on where you stand. So if you're looking in a certain direction, you may be seeing what you think is important, but you may be missing what else is going on in the background or perhaps over there. So the best reporters know this, and they use all three of those methods in their reporting, not simply to aggregate information, but to test what they think may be true. What a source tells you, well, is that backed up by a direct observation I can make, or is it backed up by some document that I can access? And you actually, if you look for these things, you'll see them in the best stories. They're not there all the time, and honestly, with breaking news, you don't always have the time to do all of the checking back and forth that you'd like to. But I do encourage readers to, and consumers of news, to really focus on methodology and think about and look for how the reporter has put things together. And I guess the last thing I would say, and again to emphasize what's already been said, as citizens, as consumers of news, I think we do have an obligation to pursue kind of a balanced diet. And we need a balanced diet to have the strongest bodies that we can have. We need to have a balanced diet when we're consuming news. I don't know if any of you were watching the hearings today in Washington with Brett Kavanaugh. As I was watching it on the Washington Post page, and then I would flip over and watch it on the Fox News page, and I would skip over to see what Drudge was saying. There's a lot of overlap, but then there's also a lot of difference. But that's all available to us. So it's really easy to do to get these different perspectives. I know a lot of people who don't work in journalism think that some of us are kind of ogres who have an axe to grind or a political point that we're trying to make. And just to tell you a little bit about my personal background, I worked for a couple of years for the Washington Times, which is a conservative newspaper in Washington, D.C. It qualifies for what Hillary Clinton called part of the vast right-wing conspiracy. I also spent a longer period of time writing for the Baltimore Sun, which I think most people would sort of classify as part of the evil liberal media establishment. And I can tell you that in both of those newsrooms, reporters are kind of the same. They're a little goofy, off the wall a little bit, individualistic. I don't really think that by and large they have political agendas. Sure there are some, but most of them are trying to do a good job. Most of them are trying to get the most complete story that they can. The environment is different in different news organizations, and that may shade things a little bit. But I think by and large, journalists are really very opposed to fake news and doing their best to combat it.
Great, so we will open it up to the audience. If you have a question, I'll repeat it for Mike's sake. And if not, we've got a few questions to roll with, but I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask A question about anything specific, both locally from the more traditional? Yeah?
For all three of you, what would you consider a fairly unbiased, center-of-the-road news source?
So the question was asking our opinion about what a center-of-the-road unbiased news source would be.
And are you asking for national, international, local, all of the above?
Yes.
All of the above.
Any?
Well, I'll say that I think the best paper in America today is the Washington Post. And I would, at the same time, as I just said, I wouldn't believe everything that I read in it, and I wouldn't rely on it as the only thing that I would read. But in terms of the vigor of the reporting and the creativity of the different approaches they take, I would say that that's the best. Is it middle of the road? No, it's not. It serves a local market in Washington, D.C., where the local industry is government, and most of the and most of the related fields, you know, whether it's real estate or even sports, they're dependent on government. So their readers are very interested in government, and so if you don't like government, you're not going to find that to be a middle road paper, but I think it's a fair paper.
I guess I would say there are studies out there that have attempted to answer that question of what is the most unbiased, you know, source, if you will, of information, and I don't have them with me, but I have reviewed some of them. The Poynter Institute has done some of that research. The Pew Center has done some of that research as well. And by and large, what those studies have shown is that there, and it almost might sound like I'm doing a self-promotion here, and that's not my intent, but by and large, those studies have shown that the print media, whether that's newspapers or, you know, the online, you know, versions of newspapers, because of the traditional news values that we have had for, in the case of the Northwestern, for 150 years. You know, we've been publishing, you know, something daily since 1868. I mean, we've had that long tradition of having those news values. So that's just one example, I think, of what has contributed to new print media, newspapers, and to some degree magazines, have kind of been shown to kind of be the most middle of the road. So some of the graphics that I've seen have showed, like the Washington Post, or to some extent the the Wall Street Journal, or the New York Times, or USA Today, have kind of fallen in that middle of the road. Of course, then there's some way over to the right, some way over my right, so I guess your left, some way over to the right. One of the comments that we had talked about before is just making sure that you consume a variety of different news. So not just reading the same, you know, news outlet over and over again, but selecting, like Miles did today, looking at the Senate hearings, you know, consuming it from a variety of different sources, and then trying to figure out, okay, what's different from, you know, what's different, say, from the New York Times versus what's different from the Washington Post, what's different from the USA Today, and then comparing and contrasting that to try to, in your own mind, to kind of figure out, okay, I've got these three, what do they all have in common? What's different from each one of them? And that's not just the print media also. You know, you watch the CNN and the Fox News, MSNBC, and you know, other news outlets as well, to kind of get a balanced approach to that.
Personally, I tend to gravitate towards the BBC. They're actually not this nation, so sometimes I feel they're less far right or far left, because while some will say they do care, I don't believe they care as much as people here with the big bucks do. But mostly I consume my news from Twitter, and I have a list where I follow multiple news organizations, but then I can search that list for whatever the topic is of the day. And I actually have to review the news every day for work, and when I'm looking for health, public health, medical news, if I need to verify something, I'm going to our national associations or our state associations to see what their take is on it, because people rant and rave about legalizing marijuana use or what we should feel about fair maps, but when I need to give my boss something legitimate, I always back it up with the association. So if you have something like that with work, it's usually a good backup check.
Thank you.
We got to, go ahead.
We back before the current president authorized the fake news. The role of many people in government was to either say no comment or cannot attribute to the community. That became fake news because it was not attributable. But I'm thinking back in the day in which a newspaper reporter would stop and talk to me, I would say I can't comment on that current situation. So they would have to come up with whatever they would surmise, but we would not give them the official until it was time to do that type of thing. And I think, that's much fake news, but the deadline you're working under requires that you get something out by 5 a.m. in the morning or whatever. That happens. It was not fake news. It was just real life.
Right. Agreed. Kind of to surmise that for the mic a little bit, before when there was deadlines to people having to give a report real time, and sometimes they didn't have all their facts checked. Yeah, it did make it a little harder. Well, and the nice thing now too with online print, you can make corrections so easily. So it's not necessarily that everything goes out the door and you can't pull it back. It's obviously different for the newspaper, but you also have online versions of that. How often does that happen?
Well, and I think that the larger issue isn't necessarily there being incorrect information, because we take steps to make sure that we're not putting information out there that's not correct. I think more often than not, what happens is we might put information out there that might not be all of the information. So it might not be the complete story. But like you said, with the magic of technology and updating a website, we can always go back, and once we get more information, almost immediately add that to the story. So what you've seen is a kind of a transition from having in that morning's paper having that full story to throughout the day. If you go back to say like our website and you follow the same story throughout the day, at the beginning of the day it might have 2 paragraphs. At say 11 o'clock or noon, you could have 4 or 5 paragraphs. Then by towards the end of the day, it could eventually it ends up being the full story. And so does the first posting at say like 8 o'clock in the morning, does that have does that only tell part of the story? Quite possibly. But yeah, I think that's a good point in terms of being able to get information at different times.
I don't want to knock the paper, but I don't think you have the reporting staff to go out there and establish relationships that were established 25, 30 years ago. I mean, at one time, reporters knew me by name, and I knew them by name. And I never was in the valley here, but I don't know anybody. But today, I'm not sure you have the reporting staff that can develop that relationship there. We just are not out there enough.
And yeah, that's certainly a challenge that I think we've seen. As there's more, and let's face it, there are fewer people reading the physical print newspaper, and you combine that with the development of technology and the internet, and more and more people gravitating towards that. And that could be a whole entire different discussion, but I think the thing that we still strive for is to try to do that as much as possible. So, yeah.
I think one of the things that you're getting at is the whole question of source relationships and the relationships that reporters have with sources. Where, on the one hand, it's good to have a relationship with somebody who's in a position to make news or to provide news, and you want to, over time, develop a level of trust so that information is flowing back and forth. and so that the reporter has a clear picture of what's going on. But as those relationships develop, there is also the danger of manipulation, and probably more so in Washington than locally, where a government official, or a good example would be in Congress, where you have two different parties and they each have separate, different opposing agendas, and how they will take a reporter aside and give some information. And when you're in that position as a reporter, it's honestly, it's very difficult to be the honest broker, because you're being given information that has some weight to it and a vector to it, and there's kind of an exchange. You're going to, I don't want to say really slant it, but you may allow it to come out the way that your source wanted it. If you're a good reporter, you will contextualize it and get other voices to it. But if you don't protect your sources and nurture your source relationships, you run the risk of being shut out. And so, but that goes back to the point that I was making about how the best reporters have multiple sources of information. I think reporters who are too dependent on human sources can't avoid the situation I just described. But the best reporters will also look at documentation, and they'll do their own direct observations and bring those things together.
There's a question up front.
Yes, I want to change it slightly. I am wondering, are we seeing fake ads mostly on TV and on the radio? There are places that advertise for free. Just call us, and if you need a plumber, we'll tell you who the plumber is that you should go to. Or if you need a place to put your parent in a nursing home, we will give you the right information to take care of your mother. And I'm getting the feeling that the only places they recommend are places that pay a fee to the people putting these slick ads on the TV. And I don't think that, I'd like to see the newspaper do a story on fake ads, that someone is making money off of it. And they're getting them, there's a term for it when you pay someone to get you a customer. And if you don't, if the place doesn't agree to pay, you don't get recommended.
Right. So the question being, how much clout do you put, or how prevalent do you think fake advertising is? More of that scam artist.
I think for me, that's kind of a little bit outside of my area expertise, though what I can speak to in that regard is, again, going back to being a responsible consumer and making sure that you're reading things or viewing things carefully, noticing if there's, a note at the bottom of the screen or in the corner of the...
Small type.
Yeah, and sometimes that's a little bit small, perhaps on purpose, but kind of trying to pay attention to what some of those disclaimers are, or if you see a name, like a company name or an organization, to go ahead and do your own research to kind of independently verify, like journalists would almost. To try to vet some of that, and be if you can't find information on it and it's not immediately known as a reputable source, just exercise caution is, I guess, what I would say.
The one that will take care of your elderly mother uses a well-known Hollywood person to be the voice on the ads.
I don't have any personal knowledge or experience with that, but I would agree with what Nathaniel said. Some version of this has been around for a long time. For example, you don't get to put a Better Business Bureau certificate in your window unless you've joined the Better Business Bureau. So there's a little bit of exchange that's always there. So it may be worse when it's amplified on electronic media, but it's been out there.
The other one are all these people that are going to help you if you only owe $10,000 in taxes. And they always get the endorsement of the Better Business Bureau. And very few other ads get the endorsement of the Better Business Bureau because the place isn't asking for their endorsement. But you gotta owe 10,000 in taxes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember too that at some point press was brand new, and then radio was brand new, and then TV was brand new, and each one, you know, threatened to be the demise of our society. But it's exponential. Technology is making everything change so fast that we as consumers haven't adapted to be responsible with social media quite as fast as it's grown.
Well, and to go off of that, I think one of the things that we talked about here tonight was the aspect of, you know, being responsible consumers. And I think that's important, that as an engaged public, we have to be responsible about what we're reading, what we're seeing, what we're viewing, and be able to do our own research to know that this information is information that I can trust, or this is information that it might not be that trustworthy or factual. But I think we as journalists also have a responsibility. And I think that the big thing that we can do to combat fake news is really to practice and promote quality journalism. And I think, you know, there's a variety of different, you know, pieces to that. I mean, from independent reporting, kind of some of the things that Miles talked about, you know, getting you know, a variety of different sources, not just relying on, say, people, but also on documents or on officials, but also people who are affected by a situation as well. So that's all part of quality journalism. Another piece being, you know, making sure that during the editing process we're being fair and we're being accurate. And one of the important pieces that I always like to talk about is even if you're not biased on a personal or even a professional level, there's also that concept of having a perception of bias. So if the reader or if the viewer is looking at the articles or the content that you're putting out there and they perceive it as being biased, in their mind you're already biased, and there's really nothing that you can do to change that. So I mean, there's different things that you could talk about in terms of, you know, how much weight do you give one side of an argument versus the other. I'm looking at the room here. I'm presuming that a lot of us are, at least have heard of, say, like, and I'm sure Miles knows about this as well, since you probably teach about it, the fairness doctrine back in the 40s, when they started with the broadcast journalism having to give equal time to various opinions or various dissenting viewpoints as well. But where do you draw that line? One of the examples that I always like to talk about is, you know, do you give equal time or equal opportunity in your article from people who are talking about something to do with the solar system, and do you give equal opportunity or equal weight to those of us who believe or say that the Earth is round and revolves around the sun, and give them equal time to those who are saying, well, the Earth is flat. If you go far enough, you're going to fall off. So at some point, I mean, I don't necessarily, there is no necessarily right answer to that per se. I think it's something that, you know, there's that perception of bias. Are you giving an equal amount of time to both sides? But then you also have to weigh, you know, is there one side that is more factual than the other? And if you're giving more weight to a side that's more factual than the other side, can you be accused of being biased? That's another piece that usually comes to my mind when we're talking about fake news and things like that. And then of course when we do make a mistake, you know, everybody makes mistakes. None of us are perfect. Owning up to those mistakes and saying, hey, we made a mistake, we did something wrong. And then obviously correcting that. So this is the correct information. And even in the realm of technology and digital and things like that, we will even put on our website, we won't just change a story to make it correct if it's incorrect. we will at the top of the story put correction. We changed the story to update this information, and here's what the correct information is. So it's all about those core tenets of journalism, whether it be those pieces of journalism, producing quality journalism, or you could spend a whole another hour talking about ethics as well. There's the Society of Professional Journalists has its own code of ethics. USA Today Network Wisconsin, the Northwestern has our own ethics, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Anything else? Yes?
Well, how about her first?
Sure, I didn't.
Okay, I was just kind of wondering, like, I don't see them in the paper too often anymore. We've been here 33 years, and when we moved to town, one of the first things we did was get a subscription paper. They always used to have more of those editorial opinion columns, multiple times, a week. And on Sunday, there'd be maybe a couple. I don't see those anymore. Is that kind of like dying out? Or would I have to read bigger papers?
Sure. I think from my perspective, and I'll repeat the question for you. The question was kind of talking about opinion content and having there traditionally being a lot more kind of editorials and opinion columns and things like that in the physical print newspaper. And is that the question being, is that kind of dying off, or what's going on with that? And I think to some extent one of the things that we as an organization, the Northwestern and other papers have kind of been trying to deal with is that transition from folks reading that print newspaper to folks getting their information and reading that online. And as I kind of mentioned before, one of the things that it's no secret that fewer and fewer people are getting that print newspaper. So what we've kind of decided to do is make that conscious decision to invest more of our time and resources into the digital, into the online, the computer, the social media, on the phones and on tablets and things like that, so that we can survive for another 100, 150 years. And as part of that, what we're doing is we're looking a whole lot more on like what people are actually looking at, what they're reading, how many people are clicking on what stories, and what our research is showing us is that fewer and fewer people are looking for that type of information. So it is valuable, and we continue to offer some of that, but it is less as the years have gone on, primarily because we're wanting to focus on what we call solutions journalism. So we don't want letters to the editor, just every month it's the same person writing a letter to the editor saying, I don't agree with this politician, or I don't agree with that politician, but not really offering any sort of solution, or here's what I would like to see type of information. So there's kind of a shift there, primarily based on what our research is showing people are looking at and what they want to read, and trying to balance that with what they need to know to be, and what others need to know to be more productive, engaged members of society.
Yes?
So being a responsible consumer, that phrase has been put out there a few times. I'm curious what it means to you, different panelists, to be a consumer. I understand from what you said about being responsible in your consumption, but that word doesn't seem to speak to the heart of being a person. And so I feel like that term is just so foreign to my mind to call myself a consumer. So I want to understand what that might mean.
All right.
Academically speaking, or relating to the news.
So she's wondering what, in our opinion, being an actual consumer is. I can definitely hear how it's foreign to say be a responsible consumer, and that puts the charge on you. That's saying that, you know, what they're doing is just beyond our control and it should be up to you. And living in the public health world, I don't like that terminology. I like it when we have access to, you know, better health opportunities. I like it when the environment is healthier. I like it when their systems change. Right now, that is just what I use as a buffer until some of this, you know, gets sorted out at a national level, at policy level. It's hard to know what to say other than stay off social media. So I kind of use it in the terms of use it but with a grain of salt, knowing that just because you saw it on the internet doesn't mean it's the truth. And someone's truth can be different than someone else's. We just, it seems like we're getting worse and worse at having civil discourse and being able to disagree in an okay frame of mind. We only seek out those that are our friends and agree with us, which is unfortunate because we don't make progress if we don't disagree and question one another. So that's what it means for me.
For me, I think to speak to your question about specifically the word consumer, I agree. I think that's kind of a jargon kind of word that people in our kind of industry will usually use. To me, when I use the word consumer, I'm just talking about someone who consumes the news, someone who is, and it used to be someone who's a reader, somebody who's reading the news. But now there's so many other different forms, so many other different media that are out there that can take. So it's you know, not just a reader, it's not just a viewer, it's not just a, you know, someone who's browsing on the internet. And I think that's why sometimes I personally kind of find myself defaulting to that word consumer, because, you know, after all, it is kind of a businessy type word. But for me, it really means traditionally what we would call readers. And just like you would consume food, I think people consume information and consume that news. So that's kind of what is going through my head, kind of an analysis, a breakdown of when I'm using the word consumer. But I agree, it's kind of a jargon kind of word that doesn't really mean anything to a lot of people.
Yeah, I think a better word to use, but it doesn't get used when we're talking about news, is citizen.
Yes. Yes.
That's really what we should be about, is improving our polity, the civic infrastructure that we have. But consumer gets used in part because news organizations are businesses. And so they have consumers to serve who consume the news, but they're also important to advertisers because they consume automobiles and life insurance and all kinds of other things. And I think that leads to a confusion of purpose, unfortunately. And interestingly, to pick up on something that Nathaniel said, that with social media and with digital technology, we as journalists are now served up with lots of information about what you guys actually like to read, or what you do read. It used to be, we would argue in the newsroom, you know, well, write this kind of story because that's what readers like, or write that story because that's what readers like. But we didn't know, that was just what we wanted to do. But now, you look on your dashboard and you see, oh, that story has really gotten legs on social media and it's got so many shares, and this story, readers are spending so much time with that story. And there's a danger in that, because you know, there's a tension. You want to meet people's needs, you want to give them what they want, but that can go too far. You know, probably the most popular story that I've published in recent weeks had to do with these party bikes that the city has just approved, you know, where they're going to let you drink beer as you go around on these big bikes all over, well, mostly on the south side. When I wrote that story a couple of weeks ago, it just, it took, you know, off the charts. And, you know, should I just write about party bikes? I mean, that's what that seems to say. But no, I mean, that's wrong. And then, you write a story about, you know, Oshkosh Avenue is going to be closed for a month, and it's going to affect a lot of people, but it's not the kind of thing that people are going to get excited about and spend a lot of time reading. I mean, it's a pretty straightforward story. It's going to be closed for 3 to 4 weeks. But you can't throw it out. You can't ignore what people are doing. But at the same time, I think that traditionally there has been, and again, to go back to something that Nathaniel said, if you go back to the era of the fairness doctrine, there was a sense that, you know, sometimes we would serve you your broccoli, the stuff that you didn't want to eat, but was good for you nonetheless, and so we put it in front of you. Or at least we put a mix of things in front of you. And as I was saying earlier, there is now a move afoot to think about how we should regulate electronic or digital media, I should say. And that should give us all pause, because I think, you know, the First Amendment is important to us and to our democracy. And yet, even leading technologists are saying, you know, social media is making a mess of things. So how do we wade into that situation? Maybe we come back to something like the fairness doctrine, which, you know, if you recall, was based on the idea that these were public airwaves, that the public owned the spectrum. And so if we were going to let radio and TV broadcasters use them for free, which is what we do, that to pay society back, they should reserve some time just for the public good. So, you know, maybe we should move in that direction, and that might address the consumer citizen question.
I think one of the challenges for me as an editor, and I do some reporting as well, is you know, getting people to read those stories that are the broccoli and read those stories that are the carrots. And what I find myself doing is trying to be more creative in terms of storytelling techniques, and how do we go about telling that same story. Say, example of the city is considering the 2019 budget. How do we go about reporting about budget deliberations and all that kind of those dry numbers, but because people still need to know that, but how do we go about reporting that in such a way that, you know, people will actually read it? We can do the best budget story in the whole world and have, you know, and I'm exaggerating here, but have like 20 different sources and talk to all these people about what's going on in the budget. But if nobody reads it, or 2 people read it, or, and again, I'm exaggerating here a bit, but was it really worth us spending the time doing that? So what I find myself doing a lot is trying to figure out, okay, is this a story that we would tell in a traditional way? Is it a story, and I almost hate to compare myself to BuzzFeed, but is this a story that will be 5 things to know about the city budget, and just list, you know, do bullet points and say these are the 5 most important things that our expert, that, you know, our city reporter John went to the meeting and picked out, you know, from his expertise, picked out what he thinks the 5 most important things about the city budget are. So yeah, there's a lot. There are stories that people need to know versus what they want to know. But the challenge, I think, is trying to figure out how to sneak some of that broccoli in there.
Good luck. Margie.
I'm curious, it seems to me that headlines are becoming more sensationalistic. Is this something I'm imagining, or is there a reason that headlines have changed for the online consumption compared to what they were then? And I don't mean just point size, but I mean, is it written for any specific purpose now that it's online?
I think there are different, you know, if you take a look at, and maybe Alana can speak to some of this perhaps, or Miles as well, but I think there's different purposes now, I think, for headlines, depending on where you're looking at it. So traditionally in the print medium, in the newspaper, there was one headline and that was it. That would tell you, you know, what's going on, what's the thesis statement, if you will, of this news story. But now with digital, you've got, you know, the headline that will show up on the Facebook post. You've got the headline that will show up on the front page of the website or on the mobile app when you open it up on your phone. You've got a headline that shows up on the story. You've got in some kind of sense, not necessarily a headline, but you've got a description that goes along, on the Twitter post. And each one of them have like their own character limits and things like that, and you want to try to be balanced with those as much as possible. But then the other thing is that a lot of times we, obviously as journalists, we want our stories to be out there. We want people to read them. But we also want, we want to have, certain, if anybody's familiar with the way kind of Google works with search engine optimization and all those types of things, that Google will pick up certain keywords in, say, like a headline, and then those words will be, if somebody searches, say, like example, Oshkosh City Budget. So if you have those words, Oshkosh City Budget, in one of those headlines, and you have it close to the front of it, and somebody types in Oshkosh City Budget into Google, your story is going to come up. So it's not just one headline anymore. There's so many different kinds of things that go into that, and I mean it's quite complex. So I don't know if anybody else has anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think the big issue is analytics. So the information that we get back to see how people respond to our headlines, and that can drive us in certain directions. So if you want somebody to not simply come to your web page but spend some time on your web page, you might write a headline that may even say, click here, or find out why this is the worst thing ever, because you're actually wanting them to take that extra step of clicking through. And unfortunately, you see that. You can see consumer, reader behavior, user behavior right in front of you. But mitigating against that a little bit is what Nathaniel just mentioned, which is the search engine optimization, where you used to be able to write clever headlines because they were just going to be in print, and you play with puns sometimes and things like that. But a headline that doesn't specify that it's Oshkosh will not get picked up by a search engine. So if you had a story, 20 years ago about the city budget, you might just say city budget, and everybody would know in print you're talking about Oshkosh. But if you put a headline online that simply says city budget, it gets lost in Google because Google doesn't know what city you're talking about. And so I find that actually I go in the other direction, that I'm probably writing clunkier headlines that are easier for Google's SEO machine to read than the other way.
Yeah, it ends up being more awkward because you're trying to do something that matches what Google or whatever channel requires, but it is also fun enough to read, so it's difficult. All right. Well, I wanted, we got one more? Where?
Well, I was just going to ask real quickly that you've mentioned propaganda is the same as fake news, is the same as hoax, and that journalism, at least in Oshkosh, has been around for 150 years. But being a teacher and being a practitioner of it, how has that changed? You're still dealing with propaganda, hoax, fake news, but it also sounds like, are you now teaching to Google Analytics? How has that whole thing changed, and how has it really stayed the same? If you can sum that up in 5 minutes.
Good. Well, so I'm a teacher and a practitioner because I do have a website and I do reporting, and we do teach analytics because you have to. You want to get people ready for the industry, and that's what they have to do. I think one of the real challenges of teaching today is simply that there is so much to teach. I mean, that when I started teaching 20 years ago, analytics didn't exist, so I didn't have to teach that. I didn't have to teach what Nathaniel was just mentioning, that when you write a headline, you have to think that it's going to go in 6 different places. You just, this is how you write a good headline. So it has become more complicated, and the challenges are only getting bigger.
Yeah, I think in general, the way the news is presented and all of the, in terms of technology and how people interact with and engage with a news story is incredibly different even than what it was, say, 5-10 years ago, let alone 150 years ago. And I mean, there's different storytelling techniques and things like that that you kind of have to adapt or learn, how to write, 6 different headlines, or, ways to get people to eat their, broccoli versus, have that piece of cake. But at the heart of it, I think there still are those core tenets of journalism that if you are a true practitioner of journalism, you will not let go of, whether that be accuracy or fairness or the ethics piece. And I think that the pieces of journalism that do the best are going to kind of survive, whatever transition might be happening with the technology side of it, are going to be the ones that are still holding true to those core pieces of journalism. And that's where you get, the types of reporting that really makes a difference in the lives of citizens. Whether that be talking about youth mental health or suicide or college affordability or things going behind the scenes in government or foundations or that type of stuff. I think those are the pieces of journalism that people are really latching onto because they want to be able to see and help affect change in their community. So I think while all of the technology and all that kind of pieces have changed dramatically, I think there's still that hunger and that desire for true, like I was saying earlier, the true quality journalism that we've been doing.
Well, I want to thank Nathan and Miles for coming in and giving their expertise. We will hang around for a little bit if you have further questions. Thank you for the library hosting this whole programming for adults towards an informed electorate. That is right in line with what the League of Women Voters hopes to do. We are nonpartisan and we want you to be engaged citizens, educated citizens, not consumers, but citizens, ready to vote and feeling empowered that you know how to make the right decision for you. So there is a table on your way out with our brochures and contact information if you need to get a hold of anyone on the League, or maybe we'll see you at our luncheon in the future. But with that, I want to thank everyone for coming.